Dry Willow, Montana Territory, was not a place built for softness. It was built for necessity. The late autumn of 1879 had drawn the land tight, a drumskin ready to tear under the hammer of the relentless wind. The Northern Pacific Railroad line, the town's only reason for existence, bisected the settlement like a scar, and every afternoon, the dry wind from the jagged purple mountains to the west swept through, coating everything: the plank walkways, the saloon steps, the windows of the general store in a fine layer of ochre dust. The little prickly pear river, usually a noisy, life-giving vein, was reduced to a miserable, slow-moving trickle of mud and algae, a visible testament to the drought that was tightening its grip on every rancher's throat. The cattle, thin and restless, mooed and dry, hacking coughs that carried for miles on the wind, a sound of profound distress. Life here smelled of raw leather, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of rust from the rails and equipment. At night, the distant, keen howl of wolves reminded the settlers that they were only temporary tenants on this vast, unforgiving piece of earth. Eliza Jane Hart was a woman who understood necessity, and she understood the dry wind. At 26 years old, she had carried her sewing machine and her portable cast-iron stove across 3 states, and she had built a life on the dual pillars of competence feeding the body and covering it. She was a moving baker and seamstress, a useful kind of wanderer, but her true distinction lay in her physicality. Eliza was stout, built like a good, solid brick chimney, not the frail, quick-burning kind of candle the territory often preferred. Her hands, kneading dough or running a swift needle, were strong, but her true strength lay in her quick, honest wit. She had learned early that a woman who carried a little extra of herself had to be twice as sharp and 3 times as honest. Her deepest goal was simple self-sufficiency, but beyond that, she yearned to be chosen for herself, not for some mistaken notion that she was easy to keep or less likely to run off. She wanted her worth measured by her substance, not her size. Today, she stood outside the dry goods store, tending her small wagon oven where loaves of rye and apple pies cooled. She wore a starched, clean apron over a practical blue dress, and her face, slightly flushed from the oven heat, was concentrated. Tucked into the bodice of her dress was the single piece of heirloom silver she owned, a small, sturdy fork her mother had given her. It was a humble, almost mocking piece of inheritance, but the family motto attached to it was profound: eat every meal well, and love every meal with kindness. From inside the cool, dim depths of Nash's General Emporium, a man watched her. Calder Nash, the owner, creditor, and unofficial tax collector of Dry Willow, possessed the kind of refined manners that made the local ranchers immediately suspicious. Nash was a man of clean linen and thin, elegant hands that never touched an honest shovel. 37 years old, he had the smile of a man who owned the paperwork, which in Montana meant he owned the future. His ultimate goal was to acquire enough surrounding ranch land to sell in one lucrative block to the ever-expanding Northern Pacific. Elias Rourke's Sage Bend Ranch, nestled beside the most stable water source remaining, was the last, most crucial piece of the puzzle. Nash emerged, giving Eliza a brief, courteous nod, the kind a king might give a useful peasant. He was followed by Jed Pike, a thick-set, silent man whose shoulders seemed permanently hunched into a fighting posture. Pike was Nash's foreman, but everyone in town knew he was the heavy, the hired muscle used to persuade reluctant debtors and enforce the fine print of Nash's loans. Before Eliza could offer Nash a fresh roll, she was intercepted by the social antagonist of the territory, a woman whose mere presence seemed to suck the moisture from the air. Prudence Vale, president of the Society of Proper Women, approached with the precise, clipped gait of a woman who measured out her breaths. Prudence was fragile-looking, perpetually draped in a high-collared gray dress, and she fiercely maintained the social standard that a proper territory bride must be slender, demure, and easily managed.
"Eliza Jane,"
Prudence said, her voice thin as wire. I see your bakery is doing well. Such a pity the cook seems to share so much of the ingredients' enthusiasm. Eliza turned slowly, wiping flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist. Mrs. Vale. A joy. As always. You know, Ma always told me a little substance provides good insulation against the cold words of the thin-spirited. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the small crowd waiting for the stagecoach. Prudence bristled. It is not a matter of spirit, Eliza. It is a matter of decorum. No man wishes to marry a woman who cannot maintain a certain standard of grace. They require wives who can hold their shape, their tongue, and their principles. Eliza just winked, picked up a loaf of bread, and tossed it to a ranch hand who caught it mid-air. Well, if they only marry the ones who are all corners and edges, then I suppose there will be all the more hearty fare left for the rest of us. Mrs. Vale. Now, what can I get for you? Dear, perhaps a small, sharp biscuit to go with your sharp words. Prudence sniffed, her victory deferred, and marched into the store, her silhouette thin against the light. Nash watched the exchange with a cool, calculating amusement, recognizing that Eliza Jane Hart was a force not easily dismissed, a fact that was both useful and annoying to his plans. It was nearly midday when the man who owned the debt, the land, and the troubled future finally rode into Dry Willow. Elias Rourke was 33, but the past few years of drought, debt, and the heavy care of family had laid a dense layer of silence over him. He was the proprietor of Sage Bend, a ranch settled by his father, and it was a responsibility that felt less like an inheritance and more like a heavy, slowly sinking ship. He was tall, but his shoulders held a subtle, tired slump. His coat was patched at the elbows with a leather Martha his mother had salvaged. His right arm, broken badly a few years prior during a cattle crush and set imperfectly by a rushed doctor, still showed the slight, stiff bend of past trauma. He rode slowly, leading a nervous calf he hoped to sell for enough cash to cover the quarterly interest payment due to Nash. He carried little else but his rifle, his steady gaze, and a bridle whose leather was so worn and polished by years of handling that it felt like silk. This bridle, tough yet pliable, was a symbol of the Rourke family's core trait, persistent durability. Elias's primary purpose was to keep the land and to keep his family afloat. His mother, Martha Rourke, was ailing a weak heart that worried him daily, and his 12-year-old brother, Tommy, was quiet but clever, orphaned by the war in the East and given to Elias to raise. Elias needed to keep the house running, pay the bank, and provide a home that had more laughter than fear. He noticed Eliza Jane Hart immediately. She was a splash of sun-warmed color amidst the dust, arguing good-naturedly with a railroad worker over the proper ratio of dried apricot to cinnamon. Elias was used to women who worried about appearances. Eliza Jane worried about flavor. There was a grounded sincerity to her that he found unnervingly honest. He hitched his horse, a calm bay mare, to the post. As he tied the worn bridle, he overheard a low, sibilant exchange from a couple of town loafers near the saloon door. "Rourke's finished, you know," one muttered, wiping his mouth. "Nash is just waiting for the harvest fair to finish the papers. He's late on the big note, and the land's worth a mint to the rail company. Shame about his mail-order bride." Then the other replied, chewing tobacco, "She's due on the afternoon train. Coming all this way just to find him broke and desperate." This was the core conflict of the season, the low hum beneath the surface of the dry town. The annual harvest fair, due to kick off tomorrow, was famous in the territory not just for prize-winning squash and cattle auctions, but for the whirlwind engagement rumors it generated. The sheer scarcity of stable men and available women meant that the fair became a high-stakes, hurried marriage market, women showcasing their skills in baking and sewing, men showing their worth in riding and livestock. The pressure was immense, a gamble for survival. Elias felt the familiar, hot tension in his gut. He hated the whispers, hated the debt, but most of all, he hated the thought of failing Martha and Tommy. His pride demanded silence, a rigid front of self-reliance. But the truth was, he was at the end of his rope. He led the calf toward the auction pen, his eyes scanning the crowd. He recognized Father Doyle, the warm-hearted Irish priest with a knack for mixing spiritual comfort with sharp humor, and Dr. Lin, the Chinese herbalist whose steady hand and surprisingly effective remedies were slowly earning him respect from the stubborn Westerners. As he secured the calf, he saw Prudence Vale exiting Nash's store, pulling Nash himself aside. Her voice was low, but carried on the wind. "Mr. Nash, I only wish to reinforce the standards of this community. We cannot have the dignity of our potential brides undermined by excessive presentation. The sort of woman Rourke is seeking needs to be an asset, something refined, not a liability." Prudence glanced pointedly at Eliza Jane Hart, who was now expertly negotiating the sale of 36 biscuits to a traveling salesman. Elias froze, his tired mind connecting the dots: Prudence's judgment, the rumors of his pending bankruptcy, and the imminent arrival of the woman who was meant to save him from having to face life alone. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness toward Eliza Jane, simply because she was being judged for her strength and abundance in a time of widespread scarcity. He turned toward the sound of hooves. A small wagon, driven by Dr. Lin, pulled up to Eliza's booth, carrying medical supplies and dry goods. Dr. Lin stepped down, acknowledging Elias with a brief, respectful bow. "A hard year, Mr. Rourke," Dr. Lin observed, his face serious. "The earth is running a fever. The only thing that seems to be thriving is the debt and the despair." "It'll turn," Elias replied, his voice rough from disuse. "The Rourke land always recovers." He tried to speak with conviction, but the dryness in his throat betrayed him. He watched Eliza Jane exchange some rye loaves for a bundle of fresh sewing thread with Dr. Lin, their transaction one of mutual respect and barter, not desperation. She laughed, a hearty, genuine sound that cut through the lowing of the cattle and the constant, abrasive wind. She was not a liability. She was a promise of nourishment. Elias walked slowly toward the saloon for a drink of water, the weight of the harvest fare, the mail-order bride, and Nash's ticking clock pressing down on him. He felt like a man walking into quicksand, having only his stubborn persistence, symbolized by the worn, pliable leather of his bridle, and the memory of Martha's weary smile to keep him going. He needed a wife not just to help with the chores, but to help him build the future, to help him find the laughter again. He could still hear Prudence's damning social verdict ringing in his ears, a judgment on all women who dared to be anything other than small and silent. It was a societal headwind, just as difficult to fight as the drought. Elias knew he had to hold on to the land for Tommy and Martha, but he was starting to realize that if he won the fight but lost his spirit, the victory would be as dry willow itself. He just needed a little fire, a little competence, a little genuine kindness, to fight the cold, sterile ambition of Calder Nash and the corrosive, petty malice of Prudence Vale. He paused near Eliza's wagon, drawn by the smell of yeast and warm butter. She looked up, her expression changing from focused work to a frank, curious engagement. "You look like a man who hasn't sat down since Christmas, Mr. Rourke," she said, her tone professional but kind. "Maybe I haven't," he admitted. "I only sell these by the loaf, not by the sympathy," she added, a quick smile softening her face. He let out a short, surprised chuckle, the first genuine sound he'd made all day. He had come to sell cattle, pay a lender, and collect a bride. He had not come expecting to see the fight for his future being waged over the proper size of a wedding guest. Yet, looking at Eliza Jane Hart, sturdy and substantial against the backdrop of dry earth and dying hope, he felt, for the first time in months, a glimmer of something that felt less like duty and more like a feast. The dust of dry willow had settled for the harvest fair, the main square. Usually nothing more than a hitching post and a well, was now a riot of temporary canvas, the sound of hammered stakes, and the smell of molasses mixed with manure. It was a place of high stakes and strained smiles, where the whole community came to weigh their prospects against their neighbors. Eliza Jane Hart's booth, simply a sturdy table draped in checkered oilcloth, was strategically located near the livestock pens and the entrance to the ladies' pavilion. She was known to feed both the working men and their hungry children. Her specialty today was her signature molasses butter cake, cut into generous, weighty slices that promised warmth and sustained energy. Business boomed, yet trouble, dressed in gray taffeta, arrived mid-morning. Prudence Vale, flanked by two similarly pinched-looking members of the Society of Proper Women, approached the table. "Such volume." "Eliza Jane," Prudence murmured, her gaze raking over the stack of cakes. "Your goods are admittedly excellent. The texture is divine." She paused, allowing her eyes to travel pointedly over Eliza's strong frame. "It is only a great shame that the baker herself appears to have an overabundance of the very finest ingredients." Eliza was serving a piece of cake to a small, tow-headed boy who was staring at the slice with reverence. She handed the boy the plate, adding a generous dollop of wild plum jam free of charge, before turning to Prudence. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale," Eliza said, her voice even. "I believe in what I make. It has substance, it holds its shape, and it feeds a soul, right. Perhaps you prefer food that leaves you light and hollow, but here in the territory, we prefer our nourishment to carry us through the winter." The three children gathered around Eliza's table giggled, their mouths sticky with jam. One of them, a little girl, tugged Eliza's apron. "Your cake is better than the kind my mom makes for the ladies' tea," she whispered conspiratorially. "It tastes like going home." Eliza merely smiled, a genuine, unaffected smile, and gave the child a small biscuit. Prudence, losing the war of public opinion to a gaggle of children, retreated with a stiff, insulted back. It was during the peak of the cattle auction that Elias Rourke made his way to the pen. He had managed to sell his calf for a decent price, enough to cover the interest payment to Calder Nash, but not enough to cover the increasing penalty fees Nash had quietly added. Elias was focused. The exhaustion of the past few days etched around his eyes. He led his prized young heifer, Bess, into the holding pen. He was wearing his favorite, albeit threadbare, coat, trying to project a solid front. As he reached the railing, the aged leather of his bridle finally gave way. The strap snapped with a sharp crack, and Bess, startled by the crowd's noise, bolted straight for the open market, heading directly for the fragile display of prize-winning preserves. Pandemonium ensued. Bess, a young animal but heavy with muscle, dodged a ranch hand. Elias lunged, grabbing for the remaining strap of the broken bridle, but the heifer was too fast. Suddenly, a flash of blue fabric and white apron cut across the dirt. Eliza Jane Hart, with the unexpected speed of a woman whose body was powered by constant work, intercepted the heifer. She didn't try to stop the animal by force. Instead, she used her large, sturdy apron, unhitching the ties with practiced speed. She swung the heavy cloth like a net, wrapping it around Bess's neck and chest just enough to confuse and slow her momentum. Then, using her weight as an anchor, she pulled down, not fiercely, but firmly, redirecting the animal into a less destructive path. Bess stumbled, was momentarily restrained, and Elias, recovering his wits, quickly secured the animal with a rope. The whole square, which had been holding its breath, erupted in cheers and applause. It was a neat, non-violent, and wholly competent piece of quick thinking. Elias walked over, breathless, to Eliza. The apron was ripped, streaked with mud, but the heifer was safe. "You saved my preserves," he managed, a genuine awe in his voice. Eliza, slightly winded but grinning, shook her head. "Saved your credit, Mr. Rourke. That heifer was priced high. My apron is cheap." Just then, Calder Nash, dressed impeccably, stepped out of the sheriff's office, holding a stack of papers. The auctioneer, sensing a shift in the mood, cleared his throat and announced the next item not a cow, but an announcement. "Attention, people of Dry Willow," Nash announced, his voice smooth and carrying. "Mr. Elias Rourke, owner of Sage Bend, has just completed his interest payment." A cheer started, but Nash held up a thin, elegant hand, silencing it. "However, I must formally disclose the status of the primary collateral note, due to an accumulation of fees, including late penalties on the quarterly installment and unforeseen maintenance costs assessed. Mr. Rourke is now 30 days past due on the main loan." The news hit the square like a cold spray of water. The festive atmosphere evaporated. Nash continued, his voice dripping with false regret. "As such, Sage Bend Ranch is officially held under a notice of encumbrance, should the full overdue amount, including the recently increased penalty interest rate, not be satisfied by the end of next month, I will be forced to move toward legal appropriation." The crowd began to buzz with low, angry whispers, the shadow of the railroad, and Nash's well-known desire to acquire Rourke's strategically placed land loomed large. This was the true harvest, the reaping of honest men's misfortune. But the most immediate, personal blow came moments later. The afternoon train from the east, a massive engine of steel and smoke, rolled into the Dry Willow station. Everyone knew a passenger was expected, Elias Rourke's mail-order bride. A small, exquisitely dressed woman stepped gingerly onto the platform. She was everything Prudence Vale could have wished for, slender, petite, and pale, carrying a single, new leather satchel. She looked nervously at the dry, dusty scene. As she stepped down, a woman, one of Prudence's disciples, hissed loudly to her companion, "Look at the poor girl coming all this way to marry a bankrupt rancher whose land is already mortgaged to Nash. And who is that plump woman standing next to him? The town fool, feeding the whole lot." The mail-order bride, whose name was apparently Eleanor, heard the comment. She looked at Elias grim, dirt-streaked, and surrounded by the tangible evidence of his trouble. She looked at Eliza Jane Strong, flour-dusted, her apron ripped from saving his cow. She made her decision instantly, without speaking to Elias. Eleanor spun around and walked straight back up the steps of the train. She ignored the confused conductor and the shouted inquiries from the crowd. As the whistle blew, the conductor, a stout man with a friendly face, walked over to Elias and handed him a sealed envelope. "She left this for you, son. Said she changed her mind about the Western venture." Elias, stunned, tore open the envelope. It wasn't a note of apology. It was a letter of sharp, cutting dismissal. The bride wrote that she had sought stability, not charity, and certainly not the dubious honor of inheriting another man's debt and his less than aesthetic surroundings. She concluded with a flourish that stung Elias's pride to the quick. The sudden twist of the jilted groom, compounded by his financial ruin, made him the object of pity and cruel gossip. The crowd's whispers grew louder, fueled by Prudence Vale, who reappeared on the porch of the General Emporium. "You see it now," Gentleman Prudence called out, pitching her voice for maximum effect. "Even a stranger from the East understands that a man facing trouble needs refinement and support, not further liabilities. Honestly, what sober man would ever choose to marry a woman? Of that substantial size, a heavy woman is the hallmark of a lazy household. Lazy means poor, and poor means trouble." The words were directed at Elias, but they struck Eliza Jane like a physical blow. The shame of being judged by her body, a thing she worked harder than anyone to keep strong and capable, was a familiar sting. But today, with the town watching and a good man being publicly ruined, it felt intolerable. Eliza Jane raised her chin. She looked directly at Prudence Vale, then at the circle of staring townspeople, and finally, she looked at the note in Elias's hand. She gave a small, weary shrug that nonetheless held a world of defiance. She voiced her own condemnation, turning the poison into a bitter, witty self-mockery. "No man marries a fat girl," Eliza Jane said, her voice clear and carrying across the stunned square. She repeated the dismissive social judgment, owning it as a shield. Then she dropped her gaze, preparing to accept the silence of the crowd. But the silence did not come. Elias Rourke moved, the man who was usually taciturn, hesitant to speak lest he reveal his weakness, took 2 large, decisive strides toward her. He looked at her, not with pity, but with a fierce, unwavering respect that silenced the crowd more effectively than any sheriff's cry. He looked at her hands, which had just saved his cow. He looked at her honest eyes, which had met the gaze of the judge. He looked at her substantial frame, which looked capable of feeding an army. And then, his voice loud, warm, and utterly convincing in its sincerity. Elias Rourke delivered the line that would echo through Dry Willow for years. "Then every fool's left the feast to me." The effect was instantaneous and shocking. First, an uncomfortable silence, then a few nervous titters, and finally, a deep, collective burst of laughter that broke the tension. The phrase flipped the social script. It wasn't a choice of last resort. It was a conscious selection of abundance and good sense over scarcity and pretension. Elias had called the critics fools, and Eliza Jane a feast. Calder Nash, watching from the Emporium steps, saw his carefully managed scene of Rourke's public humiliation crumble into a moment of unexpected, heartwarming triumph. Nash's smile froze, turning cold. The crowd, which had been ready to pity and dismiss Elias, now admired his unexpected boldness and Eliza's quick wit. Nash realized he could not simply wait for Rourke to fail. He had to set a trap. He smiled thinly at Elias and motioned to Jed Pike. "The inspection of the Sage Bend assets is scheduled for Monday next. Mr. Rourke," Nash called out, his voice now dangerously polite. "You may have won a temporary sentiment, but the law requires cash." Nash turned away, the promise of legal manipulation hanging in the air. Elias was still breathing hard, the adrenaline of the confrontation almost replacing the exhaustion. He looked at Eliza Jane, and the shared glance felt heavy, full of unspoken consequence. "I thank you, ma'am," Elias said softly, "for Bess and for the words." "My pleasure, Mr. Rourke," Eliza replied, folding her damaged apron, "though I fear your bold statement has now permanently tied me to your unfortunate financial situation. I am not good for your credit rating." He hesitated. "My mother, Martha, she is frail. She needs good, steady care and honesty. She needs strength in the kitchen." He nodded toward his horse. "I invite you to bring your rye bread up to Sage Bend. I want her to taste competence." Eliza's inner conflict was immediate and sharp. She had spent her life avoiding being chosen out of desperation. Am I being chosen because he needs a sturdy servant to save his ailing family? Or because he saw my competence? The fear of being chosen for her utility because she was easy to live with, easy to feed rather than her essence, was a core wound. "I do not sell human kindness by the pound. Mr. Rourke," she replied, her guard back up. Elias understood the subtext immediately. He met her gaze with his own honest, tired eyes. "And I do not weigh a person when I'm hungry. Eliza Jane, I am asking you to feed my mother, not to wed my land." That night, Elias visited Dr. Lynn to get a salve for his strained shoulder and asked the doctor about Martha's health. Dr. Lynn confirmed that Martha needed warmth, good food, and, more than anything, a sense of peace and stability. The next morning, Eliza Jane rode out to Sage Bend. The ranch was a collection of worn but well-maintained buildings nestled in the sagebrush. When Martha Rourke, small and pale, took a slice of Eliza's butter cake, her eyes closed for a moment of genuine, profound pleasure. "This," Martha whispered, opening her eyes, "is the smell of a home that knows how to fight the cold." In that moment, Eliza Jane saw the home was missing its fire. The look in Martha's eyes was not the look of a desperate woman seeking a nurse, but the look of a soul starved for the substance that Eliza Jane provided. It was not a request for a quick, convenient marriage. It was a plea for a reliable presence. It was not pity that led Eliza Jane to her decision, but the quiet, profound realization that she could build her own fire in this place. "I will come to Sage Bend for the winter, Mr. Rourke," Eliza announced, setting down her cast-iron pan with a decisive clatter. "I will be your winter cook, for a fair wage. I will not promise any engagement, now or later. I will not promise to save your ranch, which is your fight, but I will promise to keep your mother fed and your house warm. I set the boundary now, and I expect your respect for it." Elias, silent for a moment, simply nodded. "You have it. Welcome to Sage Bend, Eliza Jane." The first step was taken. Eliza Jane had chosen to stay for work and wages, carving out a territory of self-sufficiency. The town had set the stage for a whirlwind wedding. Instead, they got a calculated hiring. The battle to save the ranch, and the deeper, quieter battle for Eliza Jane to be chosen entirely for her heart and strength, had just begun in the kitchen. The move to Sage Bend was less a relocation and more a military deployment of domestic competence. Eliza Jane Hart arrived with her possessions, her worn leather trunk, her sturdy, efficient traveling stove a testament to her self-reliance, and her single piece of silver, the fork. She found the ranch house tidy but cold, its hard embers long reduced to ash. The first order of business wasn't cooking. It was establishing the rhythm of a working home. Every morning, long before the first hint of gray light touched the purple peaks of the distant mountains, Eliza Jane was up. She didn't just light the fire in the old iron stove, she birthed it. The sound of her skilled hands arranging the kindling, the immediate crackle, and the low roar of the renewed flames became the true heartbeat of the house. Soon, the heavy, comforting scent of dark, bitter coffee and warm molasses biscuits would creep through the thin plank walls, a genuine sound of home returning. Elias, still accustomed to the house's perpetual silence and the strained, quiet meals with Martha and Tommy, found himself disoriented by the sensory warmth. He would descend the stairs to find Eliza Jane already out of the kitchen, checking the water barrels or, once, expertly patching the leather of a split saddle girth in the tack room, her nimble fingers working the thick hide with surprising ease. Her life was one of continuous, practical labor. She taught Tommy the careful art of sheep kissing, a funny name for applying a poultice of rendered beef tallow and pine sap to the cracked, wind-burned noses of the sickly young lambs. She spent hours rendering that same tallow, slow cooking it over a low fire, infusing it with herbs from Dr. Lin to create an effective salve for the raw, chapped hands of the men who worked the ranch. The kitchen constantly smelled of baked goods, leather polish, and medicine, a blend of necessity and comfort. The work was hard, honest, and often funny. One evening, Elias, attempting to help, decided to boil the last of the harvest potatoes. He managed to burn them so thoroughly that they achieved a state of simultaneous crunch and sludge. Eliza Jane surveyed the ruined pot, resting her hands on her wide hips. She turned to Martha, who was watching from her armchair near the newly warmed stove. "Well, Martha," Eliza Jane observed dryly, "we have a delicate balance here. Raw potatoes feed the horses, but potatoes this thoroughly pulverized, they only feed a husband." Martha, frail and prone to moments of exhaustion, threw her head back and let out a genuine, hacking burst of laughter. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard in months, and it eased the strain around his heart. The shared humor was a language they all understood, a brief, necessary surrender to the drama of daily life. As the days turned colder, the relationship between Elias and Eliza Jane evolved into one of mutual respect built entirely on competence. Elias never pressed her regarding the personal boundaries she had set. He saw her as a working partner, and he honored that choice. One morning, he presented her with a small, neatly wrapped gift. It was a simple apple paring knife, its handle newly fitted with a piece of carved maple wood, sanded until it was silky smooth. "It's not sharp enough to cut you," he said, his eyes avoiding hers, his voice a low rumble, "only sharp enough for apples." It was the most thoughtful gesture she had received in years. It wasn't a romantic token. It was a practical acknowledgement of her body's worth, a careful respect for her hands. The instruments of her trade? He wasn't praising her looks or her softness. He was praising her ability to work and simultaneously seeking to protect her from harm. The exchange was quiet, but it was intimacy defined by action. The renewed stability at Sage Bend did not go unnoticed by the enemy. Calder Nash saw the warmth coming from the Rourke chimney and knew it meant his trap was failing. Elias was not crumbling under despair. He was being fed. Jed Pike, Nash's brutal foreman, started patrolling the edges of the Sage Bend property, riding too close to the corrals, throwing out veiled threats to the two ranch hands Elias still employed. "Nash says you won't make it through the deep cold," Jed snarled to one hand, adjusting the heavy sidearm holstered on his hip. "He says the whole Rourke family is brittle. Just wait until the real winter hits. It'll shake loose what's owed." Elias, upon hearing the reports, felt the old internal conflict rise, the desire to meet violence with violence versus the need to protect his family's peace. He knew if he confronted Jed Pike, he would be playing directly into Nash's legal scheme, giving him an excuse to involve the county marshal. He only shared partial truths with Eliza Jane, explaining only the mechanics of the debt, the due date, the rising interest. He guarded the extent of his fear and the weakness of Martha's heart like a miser guards gold, terrified that revealing his full vulnerability would only confirm the rumors and scare Eliza Jane away, dragging her down with his sinking ship. But Eliza Jane was sharper than he gave her credit for. She saw the lines of worry deepen around his mouth when the mail arrived. She sensed the unspoken anxiety that clung to him like dust. One cold, wind-swept evening, alone in her small room adjacent to the kitchen, she spoke softly to her own reflection in the window pane. Her frame, sturdy and comforting to the touch, was a daily subject of society's dismissal. A heavy woman is lazy. A heavy woman is a liability. This body has carried a stove, a bedroll, and 3 years of independence across a continent, she whispered, rubbing her shoulder. It can carry a kitchen fire. Why should it not be able to carry happiness? It was a self-affirmation, a necessary defiance against the invisible social rules embodied by Prudence Vale. She was fighting the whispers not with words, but with butter, flour, and strength. The support network began to grow around the warmth of Eliza Jane's kitchen. Father Doyle, returning from his circuit riding, stopped at Sage Bend for a strong cup of coffee and a thick slice of rye bread. "Eliza Jane," the Irish priest declared after his second slice, wiping crumbs from his beard. "You are doing the Lord's work. Your kitchen fire is the most honest sermon in this territory." A few days later, Dr. Lynn paid a visit to Martha, checking her pulse and advising on her diet. He stayed for dinner, observing Eliza Jane's quiet efficiency. He didn't just see a cook, he saw a quartermaster. "You have a fine system for rotation of goods," Dr. Lynn noted, watching her catalog the dried beans and cornmeal in the small pantry. "You are not merely storing. You are organizing for survival. We will trade 3 measures of last year's oats for 2 measures of their dry hay." "Elias," Eliza Jane announced to the men later, "and we need to separate the 2 sickliest calves from the herd. I will feed them twice a day with the warm mash. Their survival is not worth the risk of the whole herd succumbing to the cold." She was bringing logic and resource management to the chaos of ranch life, turning the household from a place of simple sustenance to a strategic supply depot. But the elements were also turning against them. Dr. Lynn looked up at the sky, where the wind had ceased, replaced by a brooding, heavy stillness. A flock of crows, usually boisterous and scattered, flew low and tight, seeking cover. "The air has turned quiet," Dr. Lynn observed, wrapping his scarf tightly around his neck. "That is the north wind gathering its army. Mr. Rourke, the coming winter will be a wolf blizzard. It will demand more than usual from your reserves." The natural world was preparing to join the social and financial conspiracy against the Rourke family. The warning was underscored that evening by the arrival of a package via the stagecoach, a heavy, official-looking envelope from Calder Nash. Elias opened it with a grim expression. The letter was a formal notice if the debt was not cleared by the newly adjusted due date. The ranch would be subject to immediate inspection and eventual repossession. But it was the attached documents that made Elias's jaw clench. Nash had submitted receipts obviously falsified for an astronomical quantity of fertilizer that Elias had never ordered or received, dramatically inflating the principal of the loan. The game had changed. Nash was not waiting for failure. He was manufacturing it. The quiet fight for survival had escalated into a clear case of fraud and injustice. The battle for Sage Bend was now a battle for legal fairness, and the gentle fire Eliza Jane had lit in the kitchen was now the only thing standing against the cold, calculated aggression of the lawless West. The discovery of Nash's fraudulent fertilizer receipts ignited a cold, hard resolve in Eliza Jane Hart. She was hired to be a cook, but she found herself becoming a strategist. The Rourke family could not outspend Nash, but they could out-earn him, and they could outwork him. "We fight his paperwork with our profit," Eliza Jane declared, standing over the heavy cast-iron stove, which was now radiating a constant, even heat. Elias and Tommy listened, Martha watching keenly from her armchair. Her plan was simple, practical, and perfectly suited to the realities of the territory's specialty, preserved goods sold along the Northern Pacific Rail line. The railroad brings people with city money who are tired of beef and beans. They want comfort food, portable and unique. Eliza Jane would bake, preserve, and jar. Her silver fork, the heirloom, became her small, unique seal, pressed into the lid wax of every jar of apricot conserve and every foil-wrapped loaf of rye bread. She decided on a playful, defiant brand name, one that honored Elias's bold declaration back in Dry Willow Feast to me. It was a promise of quality, a slight mockery of scarcity, and a subtle challenge to the judgment of the thin-spirited. Elias was skeptical, yet he respected her industry. He spent days preparing the small, durable wooden crates for transport. Tommy, 12 years old and sharp as a tack, became her willing assistant, labeling the jars and ensuring the waxed paper seals were tight. Their early success in the neighboring settlement of Black Creek drew immediate fire from the social adversaries in Dry Willow. Prudence Vale, upon hearing that Eliza Jane was turning a profit, launched a campaign of social sabotage. She began spreading rumors in the ladies' social circles and even approached Father Doyle with her concerns. "It is irresponsible baking." "Father," Prudence sniffed, adjusting her perpetually high collar, "too much butter, too much sugar. It is ruinous to the Constitution. The Hart woman's wares are designed to encourage gluttony and ill health. They are a moral hazard, not a meal." Jed Pike, taking cues from Nash, stepped up the attack. During one of Eliza Jane's weekend sales stops at a rail junction outside town, Jed and two hired hands rode up, ostensibly to water their horses, while Jed distracted Elias with loud, rambling threats about the inevitable end of Sage Bend. His men subtly moved in. They jostled the cart, overturning several jars of plum conserve and smashing a crate of warm corn muffins into the mud. "Accident, ma'am," Jed drawled, his lips curling in a cold imitation of apology. "Slippery rail bed. You fat girls should learn to hold on to your goods better." Eliza Jane's fury was a quiet, potent thing. She looked at the ruined food, then at the men's mocking faces. She knew a fight with Jed Pike would be a physical blood sport that Elias, with his mended arm, could not afford. She decided to fight back with wit and public scrutiny. She raised her voice slightly, drawing the attention of the few ranchers and railway workers milling about. "Mr. Pike, you are a menace to inventory, and your men are clearly drunk on bad whiskey before noon." "Watch your tongue, woman," Jed warned, taking a threatening step forward. "I am watching my inventory," Eliza Jane countered, turning to the crowd. "These men claim my products are too rich, too heavy, too much of a liability. But I sell by the piece, not by the pound, and I take responsibility for my product. Unlike Mr. Nash, I do not inflate my prices with hidden fees or charge for fake fertilizer." She then challenged Jed Pike directly, demanding a small public test. "Mr. Pike, I ask you to weigh one of my molasses loaves on the feed scale. Weigh it, And then I ask you to tell this community if I have ever charged more than the posted price for that weight." The move was clever. By inviting the scrutiny of the scales, she confirmed her integrity against Prudence's slander about gluttony and directly contrasted her honest, measured weight against the unjust weight of Nash's fraudulent debt. The small crowd, already weary of Nash's schemes, sided with her instant honesty. Jed Pike was forced to retreat, the mud on his boots and the spilled jam serving as his only victory. Back at the ranch, a deeper, more subtle intimacy began to form. Driven by necessity and trust, the harsh weather of the coming season demanded new, heavier clothing. Eliza Jane, the traveling seamstress, took Elias's measurements for a new winter coat. The moment was awkward, technical, and charged with an unspoken vulnerability. She stood close to him, the soft measuring tape running across his broad, tired shoulders. Her fingers brushed the stiff ridge where his arm had been broken and healed crookedly years ago. She paused, her hand lingering momentarily on the scar tissue. She did not ask about the injury, a mark of her respect for his silence. Instead, she gently applied a dab of her beef tallow salve, scented faintly with pine, to the rough, cracked skin. Elias didn't flinch or pull away. He simply stood there, receiving the quiet care. The gesture was non-sexual, profoundly respectful of his scarred, working body, and more intimate than any embrace. "Thank you," he mumbled, the words sounding like a sigh of relief breathed into the air. He felt a fierce gratitude that she had seen the weakness and chosen to mend it, not mock it. The social pressure continued to radiate. Even from within the seemingly safe walls of Sage Bend, Martha, though increasingly fond of Eliza Jane, still worried, a mother's protective instinct overriding her common sense. "Elias is a good man, Eliza Jane," Martha said one afternoon, her voice faint but firm. "But he is troubled, and he is a target. I fear he is growing too attached to the comfort you bring. He needs a wife, dear. But I pray he is not simply mesmerized by the woman who has brought fire back to his cold kitchen." Eliza Jane finished kneading a batch of sourdough, her gaze steady. "Mrs. Rourke, your son does not love the person who brought the fire. Your son loves the house. The kitchen fire is simply the proof that the house is worth fighting for. The fire is duty, hard work, and good sense. I am just its keeper, and I choose to stay because I respect the fire, not because I am chasing after his debt." Martha looked at the determination in Eliza Jane's eyes, saw the sheer competence of her hands, and the honest labor of her body. She smiled, a look of profound, heart-easing relief finally settling on her face. Eliza Jane was not a desperate woman seeking a quick husband. She was a sovereign, choosing her battleground. The fight, however, was quickly escalating beyond just the fertilizer fraud. Nash, a student of the long game, sent Elias a copy of a far older legal document. It detailed a loan taken out by Elias's father decades ago, a loan that Nash had quietly acquired, and which contained a dangerously broad clause that seemed to tie the entire Rourke property to the debt through multiple generations. The hint of deep, multi-generational injustice was now palpable, suggesting that Nash had been planning this takeover for years. The thought of walking into a prolonged, costly, and perhaps unwinnable legal battle began to weigh heavily on Eliza Jane. She had promised herself self-reliance. She hadn't promised a fight against a deep-rooted legal conspiracy. One chilly evening, Tommy found Eliza Jane packing her smallest bag, her expression troubled. "Are you leaving, Eliza Jane?" he asked, his voice small. The boy had grown deeply attached to her presence, to the guaranteed warmth and food she provided. Eliza Jane hesitated. "I have to think about my own way. Tommy, this is becoming a fight I didn't sign up for." Tommy didn't whine or cry. He just looked at her with a quiet, devastating question. "If you go, who will keep the fire?" Eliza Jane. The question was a chain of steel. It wasn't about the food. It was about the spirit of the home she had restored. It was the call to duty, the challenge that she was now necessary for the integrity of this place, That quiet question, devoid of selfish manipulation, bound her to Sage Bend. Elias, sensing her renewed commitment and understanding the physical risks she was now taking on the long, lonely roads for the feast-to-me deliveries, spent an entire day working on a new bridle. He took the softest, most pliable leather and braided it meticulously, treating it with lanolin until it was butter-soft and utterly trustworthy. He presented it to her, not for his horse, but for the calm mare she used for her deliveries. "For you," he said, laying the soft coiled leather into her strong hands. "You are going out there alone. This is not for control. This is only to keep your balance, to help you hold true when the wind is high." It was a physical symbol of his respect for her self-direction and her capacity to handle the reins of her own life. The rising stress of the debt was briefly alleviated by the unexpected arrival of Father Doyle. Elias, grim and silent, confessed his fear and frustration over Nash's escalating fraud. "My hands want to fight the snake with a fist," Elias admitted, scrubbing his face. Father Doyle, never one to skip a meal, sat at the kitchen table while Eliza Jane prepared tea. Elias, attempting to follow Eliza Jane's instructions, mixed the strong, dark tea and inadvertently added too much salt. Father Doyle took a slow sip, winced, but smiled. "Well, Elias, it is an acquired taste, like the territory itself, but there is an old saying salted tea keeps a man bound to the table. You see, it keeps you here, fighting with your head, not your fists." The absurdity of the salty tea broke the tension. The three of them shared a rare, necessary laugh, finding a moment of human connection amidst the looming dread. But the lightheartedness was short-lived. A ranch hand burst into the kitchen, his face pale with alarm. "Mister, Rourke, a pack of wolves. The big gray ones. They've moved down from the high country early, chased by the weather. They're at the lower pasture, and the heifer herd is spooked." The timing was catastrophic. The winter storm Dr. Lynn had warned about was arriving ahead of schedule. The sky turned an ominous, bruise-colored gray, and the first sharp, biting gusts of the wolf blizzard began to whip across the dry plains. Nature itself was now joining the conspiracy against Sage Bend, transforming the financial struggle into a desperate fight for survival. The stage was set for the deep, frozen trial of the Rourke family and the capable woman who had chosen to light their fire. The blizzard struck with savage intensity, the wind howling like a brass horn, attacked Sage Bend from the north, driving the snow horizontally. The roof of the sheep shed began to groan under the assault, a frightening sound of stressed wood. Elias, along with Tommy and the ranch hands, worked feverishly. But the immediate crisis was the wolf pack, which had scattered the heifer herd. The smaller, weaker calves were most vulnerable to the cold and predation. "Bring the youngest ones into the house," Eliza Jane shouted over the roar of the wind. Standing firm in the doorway, she had already piled blankets and straw near the heat of the great iron stove. The scene that followed was chaotic and utterly practical, for frightened. Shivering calves were corralled into the warmth of the living room, their soft, desperate lowing mixing with the crackle of the fire. Eliza Jane moved among them, administering warm milk laced with molasses, her large, steady hands rubbing circulation back into their cold limbs. Martha, too frail to move much, watched from her bed, smiling faintly at the absurdity of the scene. The ranch house had become a makeshift barn, a testament to the fact that survival sometimes meant ignoring decorum. The snow piled up, burying the ranch under a silent, white ocean. They were isolated, completely cut off from Dry Willow and the world. Survival became a shared, intimate struggle waged against the elements. Late that night, after securing the doors and reinforcing the windows against the wind's endless prying, Elias and Eliza Jane found themselves together by the stove, their clothes sodden, steaming in the intense heat. Elias had been outside for hours, guarding the main barn. His thick denim coat was soaked through. Eliza Jane's own outer layer was damp from tending to the calves. "You'll catch a chill," Eliza Jane muttered, pushing him closer to the stove. grabbing a dry rag to wipe the melting snow from his hair. He stood silent, exhausted, accepting her ministrations. As he shucked his coat, Eliza Jane noticed the heavy, fraying stitch holding the cuff of his shirt together had finally split, the linen tearing slightly. She took his shirt, hold still. The atmosphere was quiet, strained only by the wind scream outside. Eliza Jane retrieved her sewing kit and, with precise, swift movements, began to mend the tear. He watched her strong, competent fingers. She was close, the heat radiating from her body adding to the warmth of the stove. "You know, I am not a small woman," Eliza Jane said softly, her voice muffled as she bit off the thread. It wasn't a question, but an acknowledgement of the social judgment that followed her like a shadow. Elias Rourke, weary and humbled by the strength of the blizzard, and the strength of the woman standing beside him, finally found the words he rarely spoke. He looked at her, at the substance, the solidity, the sheer, undeniable presence of her. "No, you are not small," he confirmed, his voice low and serious. He paused, placing his hand gently on her shoulder, a brief, anchoring touch. "But small or large, you fit perfectly into my life. Eliza Jane, you fit exactly right." It was a statement of profound acceptance and intimacy, a declaration that her body was not a flaw or a liability, but an intrinsic, perfect part of his reality. Eliza Jane felt a strange rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. She teased him then, recalling the words that had started this strange arrangement. "I suppose all those other women, those neat little packages, were just too much for you." He smiled, a rare, genuine crinkle around his tired eyes. "They were fools," he repeated, the sound now a private, cherished covenant between them. "Every fool's left the feast to me, and I promise you, Eliza Jane, I will guard this feast." The affection between them was built entirely on concrete acts of care. Eliza Jane retrieved 2 bags of coarse salt she had been warming by the fire. She instructed Elias to lie on the floor by the hearth, and she placed the heated salt bags on his aching shoulders and the small of his back, drawing out the cold and the soreness. In return, Elias spent the long, still hours of the night reinforcing the main door with a heavy beam, standing guard against the combined threats of the blizzard and the wolves. Love was not a soft word. It was a commitment measured in warmth and protection. But even isolation could not protect them from Calder Nash's malice. In the deepest, stillest part of the storm, a subtle shift occurred. The wind briefly died down, replaced by a dense, suffocating silence. It was in this window that Nash's cronies made their move. Jed Pike and another man, riding through the temporary lull, crept up to the newly erected hay barn. It was Elias's main stock of winter feed. They doused the sides with a meager amount of coal oil and, quickly lighting the hay with a sulfur match, retreated into the blinding snow before the fire could take hold. Their intention was not a full blaze that would alert the ranch, but a slow, smoldering ruin that would destroy the heart of Elias's survival strategy. Their message was clear: give up or freeze. Later that morning, as the blizzard resumed its frantic pace, Eliza Jane, checking the woodpile, saw it a faint, acrid smell of burnt straw, quickly masked by the snow. She followed the scent, her boots sinking deep into the drifts. Towards the newly built storage shed, the fire had been minor, a quick, desperate attempt, but the damage was done. The corner of the shed was blackened, and the smell of smoke clung to the frozen, damp hay. Near the edge of the woods, where the riders would have sought cover, she spotted a small, dark object half buried in the snow, a distinctive, sulfur-tipped matchstick. Its head was broken off, but the wooden stick bore the subtle, faint brand mark of Nash's General Emporium. It was flimsy evidence, circumstantial, but to Eliza Jane, it was proof of Nash's deep moral corruption. She returned to the house, shaking snow from her coat, the small, brittle matchstick held tightly in her palm. Elias's face tightened with cold fury when she showed him the match and the burnt hay. The impulse to ride out, to find Jed Pike and settle the score with brute force, was overwhelming. The memory of Nash's legal fraud and the physical threat to his survival boiled over. "I will not let that snake burn us out," Elias growled, reaching for his rifle. Martha Rourke, who had been watching from her bed, her face pale but her eyes clear, spoke with quiet authority. "Elias, you will not spill blood. You will fight with the law, not with the gun. If you shoot Jed Pike, Nash wins. He gets the land and he paints you as the violent Westerner. We fight him with the truth, and the fire in this stove, not with a match or a bullet." Eliza Jane, placing a calming hand on Elias's shoulder, reinforced Martha's wisdom. She shared a powerful, healing memory from her own difficult past. "My mother was ridiculed her whole life for her size. Elias, people said she was a burden, a sign of laziness, but she fed an entire wagon train during the famine years. She kept them alive with her skill and her store of preserved goods. She was proof that morality is not found in the shape of a person, but in the heart's capacity to work and to share. We do not fight their small minds with their own small violence." In that moment, Elias realized their unspoken vow they would save the ranch using the fire of Eliza Jane's kitchen and the cold justice of the law, rejecting the bloodshed and corruption that Nash embodied. The silver fork, the symbol of honest labor, would win over the false receipt. The agreement was silent but profound. Elias put the rifle back on the wall, and Eliza Jane carefully tucked the matchstick into her sewing box, a tiny, dangerous piece of evidence. Finally, after 3 days and nights of continuous terror, the blizzard broke. The wind died down to a whisper, and a bright, dazzling, almost blinding sun reflected off the pristine, endless expanse of snow. The landscape was utterly transformed, flat and deceptively silent. In the warmth of the living room, surrounded by the smell of baking bread and damp wool, the 4 calves, tired but alive, finished their warm milk. Eliza Jane smiled, her face streaked with soot and sweat, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten. They had survived the worst nature could throw at them, the hope of a future at Sage Bend, fragile but fiercely bright, glittered in the aftermath of the storm. The thaw after the wolf blizzard was slow, revealing a landscape scarred by the cold and the fire. Elias and Eliza Jane had survived the natural threat, but the financial one remained immediate and unforgiving. Calder Nash, sensing weakness and eager to press his advantage, used the near fire at the hay shed as a pretext. He announced a hurried public meeting in Dry Willow, claiming a necessary demonstration of the Rourke family's insolvency and the danger their neglect posed to the community. The small, dusty town square was packed. Nash stood on the porch of the General Emporium, clean and well-dressed, holding his sheaves of legal documents. Elias stood quietly in the crowd, his posture rigid. Eliza Jane stood beside him, her strength a visible contrast to his contained anxiety. Nash smoothly displayed the fraudulent fertilizer receipts and the old, obscure loan document from Elias's father, painting a picture of intergenerational debt and incompetence. "The Rourke land is a liability," Nash declared, his voice earnest. "And frankly, the Rourke family now carries a burden that is too great for them to manage." He then nodded subtly toward Prudence Vale, who stepped forward, radiating judgmental piety. "As president of the Society of Proper Women, I must concur," Prudence stated, her voice sharp. "When a man is in crisis, he needs discipline and frugality. Instead, Mr. Rourke has chosen to employ a woman who, with all due respect, embodies excess. Such a choice indicates a moral weakness. A woman who indulges in that much butter, who promotes that much sugar, she makes a man weak, focused on comfort rather than the hard necessities of survival." The crowd murmured, the familiar social prejudice instantly finding root. Eliza Jane, however, was ready. She stepped forward, her hands held out in a gesture of practical honesty. Her gaze was direct, meeting Prudence's accusatory stare. I make them eat breakfast, Eliza Jane stated simply, her voice low but carrying. A man who is strong knows how to accept nourishment. A well-fed man has a strong hand for the reins, a clear head for the numbers, and the patience for a long winter. I make no apologies for my products. They have substance, and they provide substance. If Prudence here believes that starvation makes a man stronger, then she is wrong about the territory, and she is wrong about life. Full bellies make strong arms. Her direct, humorous retort turned the tide. A few of the burliest ranch hands laughed, appreciating the simple logic. The laughter was clearly weighted in Eliza Jane's favor, recognizing that in the Montana Territory of 1879, a calorie was worth more than a creed. Elias saw his chance to shift the focus from personality to truth. We are not debating my cook's recipes. Nash, we are debating your fraud. Eliza Jane stepped back, pulling the small, fragile proof from her apron pocket. We found this near the remains of the hay shed the morning after the blizzard. She held up the single matchstick with the General Emporium's faint brand. Nash paled slightly, but quickly recovered. Circumstantial nonsense. A common match, anyone could have dropped it. Elias had prepared. Father Doyle and Dr. Lynn stepped out of the crowd. This morning, I examined the remnants of the fire, Dr. Lynn said, his voice quiet, his medical authority lending weight to his words. The remnants are unmistakably a mixture of pine kindling and damp grass, not the dry wood and coal Elias uses in his stove. The ash composition is entirely distinct from the hearth. It was arson. Father Doyle then stepped forward, holding a small account book. Last week, Nash asked the town for donations to buy new firefighting equipment for the church. I took the money. I later learned that the funds were never delivered to the territorial office. Where is that money? Nash, if you are so concerned about the risk of fire to this community, why did you pocket the safety funds? The evidence was purely indirect, but the pattern of dishonesty was devastatingly clear. Nash realized he could not defeat them on the grounds of community sentiment or moral virtue. He resorted to a legal ambush. Nash shouted, overruling the crowd's rising anger. The meeting is over due to the demonstrated risk of fire and the Rourke's clear delinquency. I am accelerating the due date. I have posted the notice on the sheriff's door public auction, and forced repossession of Sage Bend will occur in 3 days. Territorial law allows this in case of property hazard. The 3-day window was a deliberate act of financial violence. Elias had money from his recent sales, but nowhere near enough to cover the inflated debt and the new, exorbitant fees. We have to make the full payment now, Elias said to Eliza Jane later, his eyes hard. We have cattle in the high pasture. If I can drive them to the railhead at Grizzly Notch and sell them early, before this repossession, we might have the cash. Grizzly Notch was a 2-day ride in dangerous, half-thawed conditions, notorious for its narrow, icy trails. It was a route no sane rancher took in late autumn. Eliza Jane didn't argue. She simply stated her intention. I am coming with you, Elias. Elias turned. Surprised? Absolutely not. Eliza Jane, this is a risk. I may be ambushed. The trail is dangerous. I am coming because you need a supply master, not a soldier, she retorted. I know precisely the caloric needs of those animals and yours for the journey. I can calculate the fodder and the warm mash needed at the halfway point. You need to focus on moving the herd. You need my balance. He hesitated, his pride warring with his common sense. Her competence was undeniable. He finally nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her strength and her practical worth. He was learning to trust her skill more than he feared his own vulnerability. The drive was brutal, the earth was a slick mix of ice and mud, and the cattle were nervous. They traveled for a day and a half with no incident. Elias riding point, Eliza Jane handling the logistics from the rear, ensuring the precious warm mash stayed hot and the animals maintained a manageable pace. But just as they entered the treacherous and narrow defile of Grizzly Notch, Jed Pike and 2 men, clearly hired for muscle, emerged from the shadowed rocks. Rourke, Jed grinned, pulling his rifle. The boss said you wouldn't make it. Time for you to lose your stock and your land. The confrontation was swift and violent. Jed's plan was simple: scatter the herd, making them impossible to round up in time for the sale, and steal the cash Elias already carried. Elias fought with desperate speed, lunging at Jed's rifle. But the other two men moved in quickly, and in the sudden scuffle, one of the men's heavy boots lashed out, striking Elias's weak right shoulder. A sickening thud echoed off the canyon walls, and Elias cried out, his arm immediately going slack. He had dislocated his shoulder. Eliza Jane, seeing Elias buckle, moved instantly. She didn't have a gun. She had a 5-pound cast-iron camp oven. As the two men rushed Elias, she picked up the oven and, with a terrifying strength born of necessity, hammered it against a large boulder. The resulting loud, ringing, metallic sound, like a massive church bell, echoed deafeningly in the narrow canyon. The cattle, already on edge, were instantly panicked by the shockwave of noise. The whole herd turned and bolted in a frenzy, stampeding away from the fight and straight down the canyon path. The surprise was total. Jed and his men, caught between the stampede and a suddenly disabled Elias, could only watch the herd disappear. Eliza Jane, still breathing hard, stood over Elias, holding the heavy iron pot like a weapon. The fight was over, but the consequence was immediate. Elias was in agony. He lay on the icy ground, his teeth clenched. "The herd," he gasped. "The herd is gone, but we have to fix this now." Eliza Jane's face was pale but determined. She ordered the two ranch hands who had accompanied them to ride fast and intercept the cattle. She then turned her full attention to Elias's shoulder. She used strips of her sturdy cotton apron and 2 pieces of smooth, hard firewood to fashion a temporary splint. The setting was brutal. Eliza Jane instructed Elias to brace himself, and with a quick, agonizing pull, she snapped the shoulder back into its socket. Elias cried out, a raw, animal sound of pain, sweat instantly beading on his forehead despite the cold. When it was done, Eliza Jane knelt beside him, checking his pulse. He was trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, exhaustion washing over him. Eliza Jane forced a weak smile, trying to ease the agony. "Well, that's what I'm here for. Plenty of me. After all, I'm thick. Elias, I make a soft pillow, and I make a good splint. My mother always said, the more substance, the more uses." It was a small, tender moment, a shared dark joke between pain and necessity. Elias knew then that he could not face this life without her strength. They continued their journey slowly. At one point, they came to an old, rickety wooden bridge that had been partially destroyed by the blizzard's runoff. They had to cross. Eliza Jane took the new, soft leather bridle Elias had made for her, the one he had called the symbol of her balance. She cut it in half with her knife, using the strong, pliable strips to secure the broken planks of the bridge, creating a temporary, safe passage for them to walk the horses across. "It's the fiber of balance. Elias," she said, looking at the 2 pieces of ruined leather, "we use what we have to get where we need to go. Against all odds." They reached the railhead. The cattle were rounded up by the ranch hands and sold at a surprisingly good price, yielding a substantial amount of cash. They rode back toward Dry Willow just as the town clock was announcing the noon hour. They arrived at the edge of the square, covered in mud, exhausted, and bruised. Just as Calder Nash and the marshal were beginning the announcement of the Sage Bend forced auction, Elias had the money cold, hard cash in the pouch around his waist. He had made it. But the final, brutal confrontation was still ahead. The town square was a tableau of financial malice. Calder Nash stood on the auction block, a makeshift podium constructed from empty shipping crates, flanked by the county marshal, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. A small, stiff territorial flag, symbolizing the dubious authority of the law, flapped listlessly in the cold air. Prudence Vale was prominently positioned near Nash, leading a phalanx of the Society of Proper Women, all dressed in somber grays and blacks, lending the forced auction an air of moral righteousness. They were the silent, judgmental jury. Elias and Eliza Jane rode into the square, mud splattered and exhausted. Their clothes still bearing the signs of the ambush at Grizzly Notch and Elias's painful injury. Elias, his arm stiffly bound in the makeshift splint, dismounted with difficulty. Tommy, who had ridden out to meet them halfway, stood by his brother, clutching the reins of the horses. Elias pushed through the crowd, pulling the heavy, dust-covered pouch of money from his belt. He slammed it onto the auction block in front of Nash. "The debt is settled," Elias announced, his voice hoarse but firm. "The full amount, including the original principal and the lawful interest. Halt the proceedings." Nash peered into the pouch, his smile faltering for only a second. Tardy, Rourke, and insufficient. He waved the fraudulent fertilizer receipts. "You forget the fees, the cost of the fertilizer you ordered, the increased late penalty for the full principal, and the property hazard surcharge for the recent fire. The debt has escalated. This pitiful sum is still several $100s short." Eliza Jane stepped forward, her body acting as a shield for Elias, who was radiating pain and contained fury. "You charge for a fire you instigated." "Nash," Eliza Jane said, pulling the small, brittle matchstick from her apron pocket. She tossed it onto the auction block. "We have already demonstrated the nature of your fees." The crowd murmured angrily. Nash scoffed. "A matchstick is not evidence of arson, madam, and your moralizing about flour and fat does not constitute legal tender. The auction proceeds." Before Nash could signal the marshal, the counter-evidence rose up from the heart of the community. Father Doyle stepped out of the crowd, holding a worn ledger. "Nash," the priest announced, his Irish brogue ringing with righteous anger. "This is the registry of donations I collected for the church's new firefighting pump, money intended to protect this very town. You accepted these funds 2 weeks ago, claiming to deliver them to the territorial office. Your name is clearly marked here." He pointed to the ledger. "The equipment never arrived. You embezzled community funds intended for safety." The crowd's murmurs turned to open outrage. Nash's face twisted in controlled panic. Then, Dr. Lynn moved forward, holding the cloth Eliza Jane had used to clean up the burnt hay. "I tested the chemical residue on this cloth," Dr. Lynn stated calmly, his gaze steady. "It contains traces of coal oil and a high sulfur content inconsistent with any domestic fire. This is not the ash of an accident. Nash, this is the product of purposeful combustion." Nash stammered, his composure finally cracking. "These are circumstantial lies. You cannot prove who dropped a match or who kept a donation. It was Tommy, quiet and observant, who delivered the final, crippling blow." He stepped up, holding out a small, jagged piece of dark, rough cloth. "I found this caught on the splintered wood at Grizzly Notch after the ambush. It's a piece of Jed Pike's sleeve. I watched him tear it when he fell." As if summoned by the evidence, Jed Pike, who had been lingering near the edge of the square, started to back away. The cloth was clearly from the heavy, cheap wool he wore. The physical evidence of the ambush and the moral evidence of the fraud converged, pointing to a conspiracy of violence and greed. Jed Pike, cornered, reached his breaking point, his eyes wild. He drew his pistol and fired a shot into the air. The sudden, deafening report shattered the scene. The crowd screamed and scattered, diving for cover. Elias, despite his throbbing, dislocated shoulder, reacted instantly. He shoved Eliza Jane hard, pushing her behind him, his injured body offering the only protection he could manage. The moment of sheer, terrifying human violence was interrupted by the overwhelming force of nature. The sky, which had been gray, suddenly broke open. A massive, deafening downpour of freezing rain and sharp hail began to pummel the town. The hail hit the tin roofs of the storefronts with the sound of 1,000 cracking whips. The intensity of the cloudburst was immediate and apocalyptic. Water rushed through the dried dirt streets, turning the square into a churning river of mud in seconds. The flash flood was so sudden that the old, rickety wooden footbridge over the main ditch, weakened by the earlier blizzard, cracked with a sharp groan and began to splinter. In the chaos, Prudence Vale, attempting to flee in her rigid petticoats, slipped on the treacherous mud near the auction block. She slid directly toward the ditch where the floodwaters were now surging, carrying debris and sharp rocks. She scrabbled desperately for purchase, her face a mask of genuine terror, her dignity forgotten. Eliza Jane, who had been sheltered by Elias, saw the woman who had mocked her size and her worth seconds away from being swept into the flash flood. Without a moment's thought, Eliza Jane ran toward the ditch. She pulled the 2 strips of the newly braided leather bridle, the fiber of balance she had cut on the trail, from her pocket. She yelled at Prudence, "Catch and through the 2 strong, wet leather strips." Prudence, blinded by the hail and fear, instinctively grabbed the ends. Eliza Jane anchored the other ends around a hitching post, bracing herself with the full, substantial weight of her body against the powerful current. She pulled with all her strength, her feet sinking deep into the mud, hauling Prudence back from the brink of the rushing water. Prudence Vale collapsed onto the muddy ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Her perfect gray dress ruined. She looked up at Eliza Jane, the woman she had publicly condemned, the woman whose strength had just saved her life. The wall of social prejudice that Prudence had carefully constructed around her heart cracked and dissolved in the freezing deluge. The chaos intensified. Jed Pike, reloading his pistol, was momentarily distracted by the flood. Elias, galvanized by the need to protect Eliza Jane, forgot his shoulder and lunged, tackling Jed into the churning, icy mud. The men wrestled, and Jed's pistol fell from his grip, sinking uselessly into the thick, dark mire. Calder Nash, seeing his carefully constructed financial empire dissolve under the twin assaults of truth and nature, abandoned his papers and turned to run for his private coach. But the townspeople, ranchers, and laborers who had suffered under his usurious thumb for years had had enough. A ring of men quickly surrounded Nash, blocking his retreat, their faces grim and set. The rain began to subside almost as quickly as it started, leaving behind a devastated, waterlogged square. The sudden silence was punctuated only by the drip of water from the awnings and the exhausted, ragged breaths of the crowd. Father Doyle, soaked but authoritative, stepped back onto the auction block. He retrieved Nash's documents, now soggy and stained. "Under territorial law," the priest announced, his voice carrying the weight of the community's judgment, "fraud, arson, and conspiracy to defraud the public trust are grounds for immediate detention. Furthermore, the community holds the right to remove those who threaten the common welfare. Nash and Jed Pike are to be taken to Helena to face the full weight of the territorial court." The marshal, relieved to have the law on his side, finally moved to arrest the 2 men. The gathered citizens, their eyes now clear of fear and resentment, quietly formed a human chain to escort the prisoners. In the aftermath, the square was still and cold. Eliza Jane was shivering violently, her clothes drenched, her feet numb in the mud. She stood near the hitching post, where the water had pulled the leather strips taut. Elias walked over, his face etched with exhaustion, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. He didn't say a word. He simply removed his own heavy, woolen coat, the one Eliza Jane had measured him for, and draped it gently over her shoulders. The warmth was instant and profound. It was a gesture of selfless protection, the only language either of them truly trusted. The forced repossession was officially nullified. The land was safe for now. The climax had passed, delivered by a combination of moral strength, practical evidence, and a sudden violent act of nature that had stripped away the lies. As Nash and Jed Pike were led away, Prudence Vale, still sitting in the mud, looked up at Eliza Jane, her face contorted in shame and gratitude. She managed a single, choked word. "Thank you." The admission of defeat, the crack in her rigid facade, was complete. The social prejudice against the woman of substance had been broken by the woman's substantial act of rescue. The future of Sage Bend had been secured, not by bullets, but by bread and the moral gravity of a community standing together. The days following the great downpour and the public undoing of Calder Nash were filled with the quiet, restorative labor of mending. dry willows seemed to exhale collectively. The lingering oppression of debt and deceit lifted. The atmosphere, once thin and brittle, began to thicken with a genuine community spirit. The immediate social change was visible. The Society of Proper Women, now led by a humbled and newly reflective Prudence Vale, did not dissolve, it reformed. They launched a new initiative, the Community Hearth. Prudence, still wearing the slightly muddied gray dress as a sign of her recent, painful lesson, publicly invited Eliza Jane Hart to share her feast-to-me recipes. The society was learning that true domestic virtue lay in competence and shared abundance, not restrictive decorum. Prudence even penned a short, formal letter to Eliza Jane, apologizing not just for the public humiliation, but for the fundamental error of judging a person's morality by their physical frame. Eliza Jane accepted the apology without bitterness. She knew that healing a community was a process, and Prudence's genuine remorse was a good first step. She didn't want Prudence's friendship, but she welcomed her growth. The primary focus for Elias and Eliza Jane was the rebuilding of the fire-damaged hay shed at Sage Bend. This task became a symbol of restored communal trust. Ranchers who had quietly suffered Nash's intimidation, and townsfolk who had cheered Elias's moment of defiance, rode out to help. The air was filled with the rhythmic thud of hammers, the smell of fresh pine and wet earth, and the sound of shared labor. The barn was rebuilt stronger than before, a physical manifestation of renewed faith in the Rourke family. Inside the house, the emotional healing began. Martha Rourke, knowing the financial danger was temporarily past, seemed to gain strength. One afternoon, she called Eliza Jane to her bedside. She reached out a trembling hand, holding two small, beautifully carved silver coat buttons. "These belong to my own wedding dress, Eliza Jane," Martha said, her voice soft. "Elias's father gave them to me. They don't hold anything together, but they are a reminder of what does." She pressed the buttons into Eliza Jane's palm. "Anyone can cook, anyone can clean, but the one who keeps the fire, the one who maintains the spirit of industry and honesty, she deserves the house." It was the ultimate, gentle stamp of approval. Eliza Jane did not need the buttons, but she understood the meaning she was chosen, not as a hired servant, but as the true keeper of the Rourke legacy. Elias, meanwhile, was undergoing his own quiet transformation. He had spent his life burdened by the responsibility of the ranch and the fear of failure, communicating his love and duty only through silent action. The crisis had forced him to speak, and now he was learning the language of emotion. One evening, while wrapping his healing shoulder, Eliza Jane expressed concern about the potential for Nash to appeal his case from Helena. "I know the land is everything, Elias," she said softly. Elias stopped her, turning to face her with his good arm. His gaze was intense and sincere. "The land is dirt, Eliza Jane, necessary but replaceable. You are the fire. What I truly feared, when Jed Pike ambushed us at the Notch, was losing you. I was ready to let Nash have the land if it meant keeping you safe. I was afraid of losing the light you brought to this house more than I was afraid of losing the title deed." It was brief, truthful, and profound, the most open emotional declaration he had ever made. He had articulated the choice he feared the loss of the woman more than the loss of the property. Inspired by this newfound honesty, Eliza Jane took a moment to reflect on her silver fork. She used a small, sharp awl from her sewing kit to painstakingly carve tiny initials into the base of the handle, C.T.M., a subtle, private joke referencing the entire confrontation. Choose the meal, choose the me. It was a self-affirmation that she had been chosen because her substance, both culinary and personal, was valued. The fork, once a mere tool, was now a symbol of her chosen identity. Daily life at Sage Bend returned to a rhythm of comfortable domestic comedy. Elias was still hilariously awkward with spoken endearments. Tommy, now thoroughly integrated into Eliza Jane's affections, took it upon himself to tutor his older brother. "Try again, Elias," Tommy whispered during chores. "Don't say Your biscuit is adequate. Say, that biscuit is the sun in my morning. Elias, attempting to replicate the sweetness, only managed. Your baking is technically superior. Eliza Jane would simply laugh, patting his good arm. Don't strain yourself. Elias, I still prefer that you tell me things with your hands, not your mouth. I prefer your steady work to your fancy words. Their connection remained one rooted in mutual, practical respect, translating deep emotion into daily acts, a shared look over the stove, a newly sharpened knife, a piece of dry wood set by the fire. The ranch began to cement its ties to the wider community, Dr. Lin needing a dry, central place to prepare his medicinal herbs, gratefully accepted a corner room in the newly rebuilt hay shed. This created a community medical outpost at Sage Bend, connecting the ranch more firmly to the needs of the town. Father Doyle, recognizing the house's role as an emotional anchor, fashioned a small, decorative copper bell and hung it near the kitchen stove. Ring this bell, Eliza Jane, Father Doyle instructed. When someone needs aid, whether it is food, shelter, or just a listening ear, let this be the sound of the Rourke welcome. Despite the initial victory, there was a lingering trace of conflict. A passing stagecoach brought rumors from a nearby town that Nash, even in custody and awaiting trial in Helena, boasted of having powerful financial backing people in the railroad hierarchy who might still try to seize the land through other legal loopholes. Elias worried, but Eliza Jane's perspective was steady. Nash will try. Elias, that is the nature of a snake, but he has been exposed. We are on the side of the public, and the public has our back. Justice may be slow in the territory, but it will come to those who stand firm. With a new spirit of optimism, Elias began planning the next phase. He knew the proposal he had in mind could not be an impulsive action, but a deliberate, considered choice. He needed a ring that symbolized their journey, their labor, and their honesty. He approached Tommy with a secret mission. They took a worn horseshoe nail from the hoof of Elias's oldest, most dependable lead horse, the animal that had carried them through years of drought and danger. It was a piece of metal that had known the hardship of every mile of their land. Elias had Tommy, using his growing skill in the forge, carefully file, hammer, and polish the old nail into a simple, perfectly imperfect ring. It was a ring born of enduring metal, of long, difficult miles, and of the profound knowledge that their love was not about finding something perfect, but about shaping something practical and strong through shared effort. The rough, sincere metal would be his only offering, a testament to a life lived and a future earned. The last remnants of winter were melting away, leaving the ground dark and spongy, but the air held the clean, sharp promise of spring. Dry Willow had shed its winter coat of snow and its long shadow of fear. The harvest fair, suspended earlier by the climax of the hailstorm and the arrest of Nash, was reopened in early spring, rebranded as the Spring Festival of Renewal. This year, Eliza Jane Hart was not a contestant in the baking category. She was a respected judge. Her feast-to-me reputation, cemented by her unwavering moral stance and the strength she showed against Nash and Jed Pike, had transformed her into an unlikely local celebrity. Elias Rourke was a man transformed. His injured shoulder was mostly healed, and his previous burden of silent duty had been replaced by a purposeful, quiet resolve. He knew the time for proving competence was past. The time for choosing a life was now. He did not propose on a lonely hilltop or in a whisper. He chose the center of the town square, the very spot where he had first defended her and where Nash had tried to ruin them both. Elias built a long, simple wooden table in the square. It was covered with a clean white cloth, and on it, he laid out a tribute, a selection of the practical, hearty meals Eliza Jane had perfected at Sage Bend: thick slices of cornmeal bread, a slow, simmered beef hock stew, and jars of her best apricot conserve. But this was not just the Rourke family's meal. Elias had quietly visited every family that had helped them rebuild the hay shed, every person who had shared laughter and comfort in the difficult winter. Eliza Jane taught us how to eat to survive the debt, Elias announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying clearly but without volume. Today, we eat to celebrate what was saved. One by one, the people of Dry Willow approached the table, adding their own contributions: a freshly churned pot of butter, a bowl of boiled greens, a piece of smoked venison. The table became a true feast, built not of individual pride, but of collective gratitude and community effort. Elias stepped to the head of the table, pulling Eliza Jane gently forward. He looked out at the faces of the community, at Dr. Lynn, Father Doyle, and even Prudence Vale, who stood near the front, her face earnest and expectant. He took a deep breath. "You all remember what happened right here. Not so long ago," Elias began, his gaze settling on Eliza Jane. He repeated the now famous, charged words of their first public exchange. "No man marries a fat girl," she said. A ripple of nervous, expectant laughter went through the crowd. "And I answered, 'Then every fool's left the feast to me.'" Elias paused, allowing the memory to settle. "We said that as a defense, as a shield against scorn. We said it when we were standing alone." He looked around the table, laden now with the bounty of the town. "But look around. People, today, the table is full. The feast is shared. The point isn't that the fools left me a woman of worth. The point is that when a town chooses to sit down together, the fools are forced to watch the meal from outside." He turned fully to Eliza Jane, his face a study in honest, hard-won love. He was still awkward, but his sincerity was overwhelming. He knelt down on one knee in the soft spring mud, a gesture that was both clumsy and utterly profound. He pulled the ring from his pocket, the simple, dark band Rourke and Tommy had forged from the old horseshoe nail, a piece of metal that had been hammered and worn by years of honest labor. "Eliza Jane Hart," he said, his voice husky. "I did not need a light woman to save my house. I needed a strong woman to make the house worth saving. I need your fire, your competence, and your wit every morning of my life. I don't need a compact wife." He held up the ring, a symbol of their sturdy, practical love. "I need the whole, true, complete person that you are." He concluded his short proposal with the blunt, tender truth that encapsulated their entire relationship. "I don't need a tidy bride. I need the whole, substantial Eliza Jane. Will you marry me?" Eliza Jane's eyes, usually sharp with wit and resilience, filled with unexpected tears. She looked at the ring of enduring metal, at the feast of shared food, and at the community that was waiting in silence. She understood the deeper meaning of his words. He wasn't asking her to fix him. He was asking her to choose him for precisely who she was. She reached out and took his hand, helping him stand up, an act of mutual support even in the moment of resolution. "I do not need to be rescued." "Elias Rourke," she replied, her voice steady and clear for all to hear. "I need to be chosen, and I choose you." A tremendous roar of approval erupted from the assembled crowd. Hats were thrown into the air, and children squealed with delight. Prudence Vale, overcome with genuine emotion, pushed through the crowd, her high-colored dress forgotten, and embraced Eliza Jane fiercely. It was the complete, public shattering of the social judgment that had once tormented Eliza Jane. The simple ritual followed swiftly. Martha Rourke, tears glistening in her eyes, walked over and carefully pinned her silver wedding buttons onto the shoulder of Eliza Jane's dress. "Welcome home, my dear," Martha whispered. "May your kitchen fire never be quenched." Dr. Lynn approached the kitchen stove, which had been moved outside for the day's celebration, and solemnly struck the copper bell that Father Doyle had installed. Gong, gong, gong. 3 clear, resonant chimes, the sign of a new, well-built home and a spirit of communal aid. The couple, now officially engaged, shared the symbolic heart of their victory. They lit a small brazier, not just for warmth, but for duty, using a massive ladle. Eliza Jane served bowls of the warm beef stew, distributing them first to the town's few wandering laborers and those who had lost much in the recent financial upheaval. Justice and human kindness were thus physically woven into the very fabric of the celebratory meal. Tommy, standing proudly beside his new sister-in-law, mumbled, loud enough for his brother to hear, "Well, now we have a head cook and a sous chef." Eliza Jane playfully nudged him. "Head cook, young man, I'll teach you to knead dough until your arms ache." As the sun began to dip behind the purple mountains, casting long, peaceful shadows over the scene of newfound happiness, Elias and Eliza Jane found a moment of quiet, stolen privacy by the still warm stove. Elias touched the solid, plain ring on her finger, the metal cool against her skin. He placed his forehead against hers. A silent, profound connection. "Eliza Jane," he whispered, his voice thick with the emotion he was finally learning to express. "From now on, the feast is every time you smile." The simple exchange sealed their core principle. Their love was not a hurried escape from scarcity, or a transaction measured by appearances or interest rates. It was a conscious, deliberate choice, renewed daily through the small, honest acts of labor and mutual respect. The woman who had been publicly scorned for her size had been chosen, wholly and completely, for her substance. 1 year had passed since the spring festival of renewal, and Sage Bend Ranch was no longer defined by the dust of drought or the stain of debt. It was defined by the deep, resonant green of alfalfa, sown by Elias and Eliza Jane on the hillsides that had once been scorched. The cattle herd was robust, and the youngest calves, beneficiaries of Eliza Jane's relentless care, were now sturdy yearlings. The most tangible change to Sage Bend was the addition of the community bakehouse, a large, well-ventilated shed attached to the main barn. During the cold months, it served as a shared oven, offering warmth and baking space for families throughout Dry Willow. It was a physical symbol of the ranch's shift from isolation to community hub. News arrived via the Helena stagecoach, official and final. Calder Nash had been convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit arson. His sentence was substantial. Jed Pike, having testified against Nash in exchange for a lighter penalty, was sentenced to several years of hard labor in the territorial mines. Justice, slow and methodical, had finally triumphed. With Nash gone and his debt documents legally voided, the remaining financial threat to Sage Bend disappeared. Dry Willow celebrated by holding its first honest election in years, establishing a new, democratically elected town council. The overarching theme of the year was the complete breakdown of the old social order. The idea that a person's worth or morality could be measured by their size or status was utterly vanquished by the undeniable strength of Eliza Jane's character and her public rescue of Prudence Vale. Substance, labor, and open choice had proven to be the only true currency. The Rourke kitchen, which was truly the heart of the home, held the primary symbols of their victory and their enduring love. Above the iron stove, hanging near Father Doyle's copper bell, 2 items were secured side by side: the silver fork, Eliza Jane's heirloom of honest eating and self-reliance, and the ring, forged by Tommy from the horseshoe nail, the symbol of durability and shared struggle. Eating, loving, and helping now rang together, a constant rhythm of domestic peace. The Rourke marriage was a celebration of deliberate, practical actions over flowery rhetoric. Life moved at a slow, sure pace. Arguments were settled not through raised voices, but through clear, practical exchanges. A carefully mended saddle strap replaced an accusation. A perfectly steeped pot of tea replaced a dramatic declaration of love. Elias still struggled with romantic language, but he never failed to replenish the woodpile, or to leave a small, perfectly peeled apple on Eliza Jane's bedside table. Small acts that spoke volumes. The change in the community's human perspective was the most profound reward. The very people who had once scoffed at Eliza Jane now regularly sat at her kitchen table, sharing meals and advice. Prudence Vale, completing her transformation from moral judge to earnest humanitarian, launched a successful community venture, the Winter Warmth class, teaching women how to sew and mend heavy clothing for the harsh season. She insisted that Eliza Jane be the instructor. Collective growth had replaced petty judgment. At their first anniversary dinner, gathered around the long table that they had brought back from the town square, Father Doyle offered the final, loving benediction. "We celebrate the home Elias and Eliza Jane built," the priest said, lifting his glass of weak lemonade. "And I must confess, I have a new theological theory. I believe God especially loves the heavy-built people, for they have more to share, and they are usually too sensible to run off in a crisis." A burst of warm laughter filled the room. Elias, sitting beside his substantial, beloved wife, winked at Father Doyle. "He's right about the second part. Father, I'll vouch for that." The economic lesson was clear. The arrival of the railroad had brought opportunity and the ruthless greed embodied by Nash. But the community, having learned through hardship and unity, now understood how to bargain, how to share resources, and how to hold their own against outside pressures. They chose collaboration over competition. The ultimate message of Sage Bend settled in the quiet moments. True love in the Wild West did not require sweeping, empty vows. It simply required two people standing firmly side by side when the wind shifted, working the land and tending the fire. Justice, they learned, might arrive slowly, but it was earned through stubborn, collective solidarity. As the sun began to set, the light pouring like dark honey over the eaves of the rebuilt hay shed and the small bakehouse, the Rourke family settled into their evening routine. Smoke rose straight and true from the chimney of the kitchen stove. Eliza Jane was ladling thick, savory stew into bowls, her hands strong and steady. Elias was meticulously cleaning the leather of his bridle, hanging the pieces carefully. Tommy, now nearly a young man, walked over to the stove and, just for the joy of the sound, struck the copper bell 3 times. The sound of home, saved and restored, echoed in the clear Montana evening. Thank you for listening to the story of Eliza Jane and Elias Rourke. Where are you listening from? Please share your thoughts below so we can connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Tales channel, like the video, and press the hype button to support us in bringing more stories like this to life.